All right, welcome everyone to our Select Spectrum webinar talking about 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. Our main focus is for fixed wireless ISPs. We'll also talk to a lesser extent about mobile services. And we'll share the discussion between the uses, the rules, the technology, and the acquisition process. To let you know, this is a joint presentation. So my name's Bob Finch. You'll see James Bridges will come on later. He's on the left of your screen to discuss aspects of this technology, and particularly the upcoming spectrum lease auction. So an outline of our presentation today is shown here. Before I get into that, I'll mention that if you have questions as you go through, please use the question box on your screen from the GoToWebinar screen. You can type in a question. If it seems relevant to the discussion and the time flow of the presentation, we'll address it right away. If for some reason it seems better to wait and address that question, we'll address it at the end. Our plan is to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions and answers. So, and we do want to keep this interactive, so we appreciate your questions as we go along. In addition, I'll mention for those of you who have access to a web browser and want to do a little bit of double duty here, you'll find that there's a fair amount of information available on the Select Spectrum webpage, selectspectrum.com, and in particular, since we actually operate and sell and lease licenses on multiple frequencies, the 2.5 gigahertz is mostly covered under selectspectrum.com/SLA for spectrum lease auction. So we encourage you to take a look at that as well. So again, here I'll go through the basics of the spectrum, the technology, the general outline of the acquisition process, and then turn it over to James. He'll talk about the tools we have for auction participants, how you can look at different spectrum licenses, how you might evaluate them and decide whether to bid or not, and develop a bid and submit it through our process. So that's the overall outline. Okay, this is the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum band, so-called 2.5 gigahertz. In fact, it covers 194 megahertz, starting just below 2.5 and extending all the way to 2690 megahertz, almost 2.7 gigahertz. It's predominantly, meaning about 5/8, these salmon-colored bands, which are known as Educational Broadband Service, or EBS. And this initial service was set up to do educational television years ago. It was used to a limited extent for those educational TV channels, but soon was converted to more of a so-called wireless cable service. And in the early 2000s, the FCC went through a series of rulemakings that culminated in a 2005 rulemaking that set this new band plan in place that allowed both mobile and fixed broadband services two-way, and that's really the use that it's being used for today. The educational channels can be leased, and in fact, most of the channels around the country have been leased to commercial operators, particularly to Sprint. And there is a requirement that a small percentage of the capacity be set aside for educational purposes. The rest can be used for commercial services. The green and blue channels here are commercial channels held directly by companies, predominantly Sprint, but additional companies as well are using those to deliver wireless services, internet access, both fixed and mobile. Tends to be more mobile when Sprint is offering the services almost exclusively and focused on major cities. Tends to be more fixed in rural areas and when the offerings are coming from other providers. So that's the overall band. A typical license is 4 channels. So if you look on the left of the screen, A1, A2, A3 are 5.5 megahertz each. Together, they form a 16.5 megahertz block. And typically, the license would include a so-called mid-band channel, A4, additional 6 megahertz, So 16.5 plus 6 is 22.5 megahertz. That's a typical license. If, for example, you're able to acquire rights to A and B, you would have a total of 33 megahertz in the lower band and 12 megahertz in the mid band, so 45 megahertz altogether. That's the standard band plan. There's a few places around the country where we've not completed the transition, but this is the typical band plan in almost all areas that you'll see. So that's the spectrum look. Here's the geographical look at a license. This particular license was one we leased in the last auction. It is held by Parkland College in Champaign, Illinois. And you'll see that around a center point, and that was originally a transmission tower. Now you can have as many transmission towers as you want within this circle. It's essentially a circle with a cutoff chunk at the southwest corner here. The reason for that is that where these licenses overlap, the original television licenses, where they overlap, they basically bifurcate that area. Half goes to each party, and so we can assume that somewhere slightly southwest of Decatur, there's another license on these same frequencies. The area shown around the license, and again, that license has a 35-mile diameter or a 70-mile radius. It's covering portions of 6, 7, 8 counties there. There is additional area shown in red that's not currently licensed. It's not currently available. It's what some people refer to as EBS white space. I call it EBS to be licensed space in hopes that the FCC will still soon license it. And here we call it a probable expansion. The industry, the community, and principally the National EBS Association has submitted proposals to the FCC that would allow this license to expand into the unlicensed area. And to the extent it touches a portion of a county, it would expand to fill the county unless there's another license expanding at the same time. So you'll see some of these counties expands to cover the full county. Others, there would be another license expanding at the same time. The goal of this is really to allow coverage in these areas that have never been licensed and to allow parties to deliver broadband service and educational services to those areas. We think it's completely consistent with what the FCC's overall objectives are. It's a process that's been under consideration for many years, and we're hopeful that this will move soon. The FCC obviously has preoccupation with the current incentive auction that you may have heard of at 600 megahertz, so that has slowed this, but we're continue to push through a variety of means to get these areas covered, and it's clear that it is consistent with overall FCC policy goals to allow expansion, whether it's according to this proposal or a different proposal. We think these additional areas will become available. So here's just an example on the screen showing what would happen, for example, if their proposal was allowed. Some licenses would expand. In places where there is no license, new applications would be accepted. So for example, in the case of Colorado, I just picked some random counties here. Alamosa County looks like there's room to apply for a total of 3 licenses, a total of 12 channels, and Arapahoe none, and Archuleta a total of 5 licenses, so a total of 20 channels would potentially be available for application. The proposal has been that this would be essentially first come, first serve, but limited to educational entities that meet the requirements to hold an EBS license, which is typically an educational nonprofit or an accredited academic institution such as a school district, college, university. So what are the advantages? Well, obviously the key advantage is freedom from interference, much higher power levels, ability to provide non-line of sight service, that there are, because of these reasons, compared to unlicensed operation, your operating costs should be lower, fewer troubles from your customers, more satisfied customers. And it's worth mentioning that since the FCC does not allow an educational operator to directly sell its license to a commercial operator, that instead this is done as a lease. And since effectively I call that built-in financing, it might be 10% of the total value up front and the remaining 90% paid out over a 30-year lease. Well, we think that's generally advantageous for particularly for a lot of the smaller operators that have high costs of capital and difficulty in, borrowing all the money to buy the license up front. And again, we'll talk more about value so you can have a better assessment of what this would mean as we get, James will discuss that as we get closer to the end of the discussion. We also think that, there's risk associated with unlicensed operation. You don't know when someone else is going to open up with either a similar business or a different business that caused interference. Many many operators in the WISP space went through the issues when suddenly the electric companies began to use 900 megahertz to read meters, and customers who previously had good operations were no longer able to connect successfully. So we think this avoids those problems and really gives you a long-term basis to build the business and should the time come to sell the business. Beyond that, beyond fixed operations today, as the world continues to go more and more mobile, these frequencies are also allowed for mobile operations, and indeed that's what Sprint's predominantly using them for today. So disadvantages, obviously there's a cost of buying the spectrum. Today the equipment is still more expensive than unlicensed, but that window is narrowing significantly as we'll discuss a little bit later. The cost of this licensed equipment is coming way down. There's only 22.5 megahertz in a typical license. So we usually find that most operators want to have multiple licenses in order to operate successfully. And I'd say the biggest disadvantage, as we'll show on this map, showing the potentially available licenses, it's just not available everywhere. It's more available in rural areas than urban areas, but between the fact that there are areas that are unlicensed and the fact that many of the licenses are controlled by existing operators, it can be difficult to acquire these licenses in the exact areas you want. So in terms of a summary of the technology, there are multiple technologies that have been used in this band for both mobile and fixed services. In the 90s, we started out 90s and early 2000s, I guess is probably a better term, started out with DOCSIS. Expedience came in maybe in the late 2000s, and then WiMAX earlier in, call them the teens, and now we're into LTE. Really appears that LTE is the new deployment for most customers or most operators who are just getting into business. There is some ability to convert some of the prior WiMAX into LTE standards. I'm not particularly focused on the technology, but I do see that the availability of the equipment in LTE and the cost of the equipment in LTE seems to be a significant advantage compared to what's available in other technologies today. We do see interest in WiMAX from some operators such as utilities that want to have more of a kind of a closed system. So all of these technologies use time division duplex, which means you're using the same channel to transmit and receive. Obviously at the speed of light, it's an alternation. There's a small buffer. The user, whether you're using it for streaming or voice services, even gaming, is not going to notice that delay. It's still very low latency overall. But this gives the advantage that if you tend to have more downstream traffic, as most ISPs do, as opposed to upstream, you can adjust the timing of the operation so that there is more time available for downstream and therefore more data throughput, far more data throughput on the downstream direction. So more flexible than the alternative, which is called frequency division duplex. For those of you who are used to operating in unlicensed 2,000 watts EIRP, is going to sound like a huge amount. Most of these systems don't actually operate at that full level, although that's permissible under the rules. Typically, for interference management and to maximize capacity, it's more of a cellular type operation, multiple towers in a given licensed area, each one reusing the frequencies to generate more capacity. I mentioned LTE is the new technology. Sprint, I think, is on the verge of having shut down its WiMAX network. They had planned to do that last year, and there were some delays, but I think they're about done with that now. So really, the band is, at least for Sprint, is moving over to LTE, and most new operators are either starting with that or looking to transition to that. As for capacity, this is a spec I pulled out. Please check with your supplier. This, I think, is a lab environment to be able to deliver 330 megabits on 60 megahertz. And 60 megahertz, we should say, would take at least 3 licenses, possibly 4, depending on the configuration. So it is a fair amount of capacity to acquire, but obviously then the ability to deliver a lot of capacity and then reuse that in each cell or spectrum sector that you have. And then in terms of the reason that the cost is coming down, over 400 million devices sold worldwide, predominantly in China, by the way. China Mobile is using this band, so-called band 41 in LTE, which is the same as our 2.5 gigahertz. So despite the fact that many of the, something well over 2,000 licenses have been leased to Sprint or licensed to Sprint, there are many other licenses available in this band, particularly in rural areas. Some of the leading entities are Speed Connect, Rise Broadband, and Whisper ISP. Other fixed wireless operators have also leased spectrum. In fact, we went through the list. We think there's more than 50 operators that have acquired rights to 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. This is not just speculators, not just different subsidiaries of a given entity, but 50 different entities around the country. So still quite a bit of operation and increasing in this band. And finally, I'd like to describe what we've done in the past, our so-called spectrum lease auctions that we conducted in 2014 and 2015. I guess first of all, to say it's probably a more accurate but less good marketing term would be a simultaneous offering, because once those initial bids come in, it's not really an open process. We take the bids to the license holder, and if they want it, we give them advice about what they can do. They may ask for an additional round of bids. They may decide to negotiate directly with a party. They may counteroffer. They may just choose to turn down the offer. So there's a variety of different steps that happens after that first bid. But we do find, and you can see in the numbers below, by offering these as part of a package, we bring in more interest from more parties. We create a deadline, which can often help in sort of moving a transaction along. And we give really a standard form for these bids to be submitted. So as James may mention later, this sort of competitive environment makes it easier for a school, which is often a public institution, to look at competitive offers or competitive process and say, yes, we are willing to move forward with these licenses or with a lease transaction. So we've found it to be quite beneficial, and you can see from the numbers that we are helping to make a market here and really give parties that would use the spectrum the chance to gain access to it, and parties that have the spectrum but don't have a use to monetize, and in some cases also get free services for their licenses. So I think it's a positive way to do it that we've been very pleased with so far. In terms of these valuations, I guess first of all I'll mention that beyond the 74 transactions completed, there's multiple others under negotiation. My goal would be to get to 100 in the first 2 lease auctions. I don't think we're going to quite get there, but close to it. In terms of valuation, the guidance we provided was 4 cents per megahertz pop for rural spectrum. And that was, explained to be an average, or a typical number is probably a better term, and that the values have indeed varied from lower than that to much higher than that. The urban spectrum tends to go for higher values in more urban environments as opposed to the rural spectrum. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to James and let him continue to describe our tools and the process that we'll use to go forward with the 2016 spectrum lease auction.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And I'd like to start off by spending a little bit of time talking about the upcoming auction, which is scheduled for April 14th. Excuse me, with signed agreements due by March 31st. As Bob alluded to a little earlier, we will have a number of different licenses included in the auction. Well, so we'll have EBS licenses that are not subject to an existing lease, or ones where an existing lease will be expiring soon. There will also be EBS leases for purchase and BRS licenses for lease or sale. In this map on your screen, the dark blue licenses are ones that have committed to the auction. So those are the ones that are actively pursuing a lease or sale. And the light blue are the ones that are potentially available. Those are the ones that we have contacted but may not have received a signed agreement yet from them, and we're still attempting to get them to sign up. But you can still bid on these licenses, and we will have a number of deals from this previous auction that will have gone through from licenses that did not commit to the auction. And now I'm sure the part where most people are interested is the valuation. So the unit of measurement for these licenses is the megahertz pop, which is the population that the license covers times the actual megahertz of the license. So in this particular instance example, we'll use Van Alstyne Independent School District's license. The call sign is WNC 709. The population is about 183,000 times the 22.5 megahertz gives us the 4.1 million megahertz pops. So as Bob mentioned, the 4 cents is kind of just an example that we're going to give for this particular instance, but the 4.1 million times the 4 cents would be $164,000. So using our standard spreadsheet, which I'll get to here shortly, we would recommend an upfront payment of $16,407, an initial monthly rent of $954, with an annual increase of 3%. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time going over our website and also the calculator that we'll show on how to come up with those values that I mentioned just a minute ago. So the first thing that I'd like to point you to is our website. It's selectspectrum.com/SLA. That's SLA is acronym for Spectrum Lease Auction. Up here you can log in which case I've already logged in over here. So on the side you can first filter by any particular state. And for this instance we will look up the Van Alstyne license, WNC 709. So this will highlight all of the licenses in Texas. If you'd like, you can filter by county as well. And also point out, so this is all the licenses that we have available in Texas. And Van Alstyne's all the way down here. Now all this information will be available to anyone that signs a bidder agreement and submits it by the deadline of March 31st. So we'll list the call sign, the license holder, and the population, and as I mentioned earlier, that's just over 183,000 for just over 4.1 million megahertz pop. And the other thing I'd like to point out is this column over here that says ALA. If there's a Y in there, that stands for yes, so those are the committed auction participants. And one other thing I'd like to point out about this is if you go to the reports tab for a particular license, you can open up different reports that we have in here. The first one that I'll show is what we call a SIM, Spectrum Information Memo. In here I'll give just a very brief introduction about the area and the license, expiration date on the license, and I think the important part is down here is the additional information about the license and license holders. This, we send each license holder that elects to participate a questionnaire that they fill out that would help a bidder better align their bid with the individual license holders' objectives. So that is some important information in there. And you can also pull up an individual GSA map of it. But if you go back to the SLA, the selectspectrum.com/SLA page, you can download our bidder agreement here, which, as I said, is due by March 31st. But you can also download the calculator that we would use, which I'll show you in just right now. So in the example I gave that had a population of 183,000, and at the 4-cent price proposed, or 183,000, and over here is at 22.5 megahertz. This can be changed if the license does not have the 22.5. So at the price proposal of 4 cents per megahertz pop, as I said earlier, that is the upfront payment of $16,470, the initial monthly rent of $954, with an annual increase of 3%. So if, for example, and this spreadsheet can be manipulated, so if you felt like that this license is worth a little bit more than the 4 cents, you think it's going to be competitive, you can change this to a 5-cent valuation, and that will adjust it accordingly. And I should also note that the orange cells can be adjusted if, for example, we'll change this back to 4 cents, if you'd rather have a nice round number of 17,000 as opposed to the 16,470, which I think the license holders would like nice round numbers as well. That will adjust all the calculations too. So all of these orange cells can be adjusted. One thing I would like to point out as well is that the bidder agreement says that the upfront payment should be the greater of $10,000 or 10% of the net present value, which the $10,000 is easy to calculate. The greater of the 10% or the 10% of the net present value can be seen down here in this yellow cell. In this particular case, it's 10.31%, so that would be the greater of it. And then from there, as soon as you have all of your financial calculations that you'd like to do, you can download the standard bid form right here. And from there, you can put in all your, you'll have to put in everything marked with an asterisk. So you'd put in the business's name, address. Very important is the contact information, along with, if you feel comfortable putting in your mobile number, that'll be great, because sometimes these are time-sensitive transactions. And then on the next page, you would put in the call signs and additional information such as the earliest effective date and the latest acceptable effective date. I would advise bidders to make a late acceptable effective date, just because of the amount of time that these deals take to work their way through negotiations and FCC approval. And then on the page 3, you would put in the actual financial information. So you'd put in your upfront payment, the periodic payment, whether it's monthly, quarterly, or yearly, along with the annual increase. And as Bob alluded to, the FCC does require that these licenses, part of it remains consistent or part of it remains for educational purposes. So that's where you would fill in the service credits and the free accounts information. And then there's also any additional information that you would want the license holder to know about. And after you're done with that, you'd go back to the secure auction site after you've already logged in and go up here to the place a bid section of it. And from there, you just upload the file and name it. We would recommend naming it as the call sign along with your company name. If for some reason you're not able to upload the bid or you prefer to email it, you can email the bids to bids@selectspectrum.com. And then if anyone would be interested in participating in the auction, you can contact me directly. My information is below. Or we also work with 2 agents, Liz Creekmore and Rick Harnish. Their information is listed as well. So I'm going to turn this back over to Bob for any questions.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate it, James, and I thought that was a good overall discussion. We did have a question come in along the way, so I'll start off with that one, which is, what is a megahertz pop? And so megahertz is the width of the band of the license, the amount, and that obviously relates directly to the amount of bandwidth carrying or spectrum carrying capacity, information carrying capacity that the license has. And in addition, the POPs is basically the number of people that live in the area under the license. So that's the description of the megahertz pop. Obviously, if you have more information capacity, that's information carrying capacity, that's a plus. And so that's the overall recommendation. And then, in urban areas, there are going to be more people, or in larger licenses, there'll be more people, so therefore it's more valuable. So this 4 cents is just kind of a comparison, a way to estimate the overall value. So far, I don't see other questions. We've done this in the past, and we've had much more in the way of questions. Certainly interested in anything on these licenses, or our process, or our auctions to date, or plans, are all fair game. So please jump in on the question screen when if you have anything that you want to ask. Looks like at least so far there's no other questions. I will mention that we plan to attend the upcoming WISP America conference, and so if you have questions that you'd like to ask us in person, we'd be glad to do that, and to be glad to meet you there. And in the meantime, we have some additional questions. So the first clock is there any block that has 20 megahertz? And I'm going to expand this. So an individual license, and I can go back to the first screen here, I think, or the one of the early screens. An individual license typically has 4 channels of either 5.5 or 6 megahertz each. So if you do that arithmetic, it's more than 20 megahertz. Skimming back up to that screen. So the A license would have 16.5 contiguous plus 6, so 22 megahertz, but not 22 megahertz altogether typically. And if you wanted to have 20 megahertz altogether, the easiest way is to get 2 adjacent licenses. If you got the, I'll give them a different example. If you got the C's and the D's, you'd have 33 megahertz in the lower band, plus you'd have an additional 12 megahertz in the upper band. I'm sorry, in the mid band in that case. So a total of 45 megahertz, and obviously there's the option to get potentially up to 194 megahertz altogether. So it costs more. There's another question here. I don't see Washington on the list. Do I have to register and log in to see all the states? The answer is yes. What we do is we give a kind of generic view of the potentially available licenses to anyone who logs into our website. So that's the example that you see on the screen right now. And if you're talking about Washington State, it looks like there's 2 and maybe an additional 3rd license. I happen to know there's several in Spokane that are on our list that we intend to offer. But you know, rather than providing consulting services, we provide auction services. So what we do is once that you log in and agree to pay us a commission if you're successful in getting a license, then we give you all the information, access to the website, names of the parties that hold the license, population, megahertz, kind of everything you need to bid. And so rather than charging for the information, we try to charge for success if you end up turning that into a lease. If you want to, you know, you can sign up and not bid, or you can sign up and bid low, and there's no obligation. In the meantime, you've gotten the information, which may be helpful to you. And if you get a deal done, you know, some point in the distant future, we have no rights to a commission, but in the short term, we'd have rights to earn a commission if you got a deal done in our auction or shortly thereafter. And all of it is spelled out in the auction agreement, which is downloadable from the website, or James or I would be glad to help. Let's see, the next question relates to how many megahertz you could get. I hope I've answered that. If not, please come back. But essentially, licenses can vary from a single channel, 5.5 megahertz, to up to 22.5 megahertz. The most common is 4 channels, 22.5 megahertz. So I hope that will. The question is the PowerPoint available online? We will put this PowerPoint online. It may be there already if you look at the selectspectrum.com/SLA page. If not, I'm sure we can get that loaded this afternoon. And we will also set up a link so that by tomorrow you should be able to click on the link on our SLA page on the website and get to this webinar again. I think we actually just play it through YouTube. Next question, and this relates to the original 20 megahertz. I was trying to see what the most 4-carrier aggregation we can put together with overlaying multiple agreements in the same market with different schools. So let's see, if you, for example, I think I can answer this question by going back up to the website. So first of all, getting four channels together with different schools is possible. We had one of those available in our 2014 auction, one available in 2015. We have at least one, and I'll go ahead and say it's in Manhattan, Kansas, available in the current auction. So if you got the A, the B, the C, and the D, you'd have a total of 66 megahertz in the lower band, plus 4 times 6 is 24 megahertz in the mid band. So 66 plus 24, that's a lot of megahertz. That's the maximum possible. And I don't know whether you call that 2-carrier or 4-carrier aggregation. If you also got the G block or some of the additional ones in the upper block, as I said, at maximum, there's a total of 194 megahertz. Without understanding all of the details of the equipment, I think you'd have to think more about this. I know that some carriers have talked about aggregating multiple 20 megahertz channels. So if you had 4 times 20, which seems like it would be possible with the configuration I talked about, that'd be 80 megahertz carrier aggregation. And so should be even faster than what I talked about at the 320 megabits per second. Other questions that are out there? Okay, well, I think I will assume that we've done our best to answer the questions that are here today. Again, James or I are available. Liz Creekmore, Rick Harnish would also be glad to work with WISPs who are interested in participating. We do thank you for getting involved. We encourage you, if you want to learn more, to number one, check out the website. Number two, download and sign the bidder agreement, and then we'll help you with getting a login. Basically, you click to log in, and within 24 hours, we'll approve your status as a verified person to be able to get onto the secure website. And at that point, you can look at all 476 licenses if you want, or just those in your state, and work to pull together an offer. The bids, the sign-up date to participate in this auction is March 31, so coming up very soon. It's 21 days away, and the actual bids will be due on April 14, so just over a month away. So we hope we will again have good participation. For what it's worth, we do plan to continue this process as we get more schools whose existing leases may be expiring. And so we hope to do this every 6 months. Over the next several years, there are multiple leases that are expiring between now and 2020. At that point, we think all of the existing licenses, most all of them, will be spoken for. And in the meantime, we hope the FCC will allocate more frequencies in areas, unlicensed areas in this band. And we thank you very much. We look forward to working with you, and we know that our other clients who have been able to acquire licensed spectrum are pleased and looking for more. Thank you.